Are we being observed from evolved humans from the future? With the advancements in technology, time travel theory and the idea that anything is possible. Ask yourself, could people from the future be among us, and if so, then why? Before I provide possible proof, I want to take you down a road of fiction that just could be true. In a popular TV show called Fringe, there was a group of people that called themselves observers. Observers were evolved humans from the future. In an attempt to study their evolution, they utilize the technology of their time period, which allows them to travel through time and space. Quite literally, they exist outside of time. They are from one possible future. In this future, the world is damaged beyond repair and unsustainable. Their endgame was to rise to a position of totalitarian power, which they assumed in 2015. Observers are humans that were created in 2167. The observers are stoic, calm, and monotone. Observers are very pale, bald, lack eyebrows, and wear black suits, usually accompanied by black fedoras. Scientists in Oslo, Norway were experimenting with the human brain in 2167. They discovered that they could remove areas of the brain that stimulated aggression and other negative emotions and replace them with rational thought. However, over time, areas of good emotions, like love, were removed in favor of higher intelligence. Over the course of many years, observers populated the Earth. Observers were grown in tanks using the DNA of designated donors, causing there to be no necessity for females. Progenies were grown at accelerated rates. However, every so often, progenies would become mutated. These anomalies had their aging process halted and were scheduled for extermination. By the year 2609, the observers had ruined the planet. To rectify this, a plan was put into place that involved going back in time and taking the planet from modern-day humans. The first wave of observers were the scientists. They were told that their job was to study the evolution of the observers by witnessing key moments in history. The 12 members of the science team were not told about the plan for invasion. They were only needed to alter the timeline in favor of their own evolution. The superior observers must have known that one of them would cause Peter Bishop to live and prevent an alternate future using the machine. Observers were given code names, each corresponding to a month in the year. Due to their close proximity to humanity, they even began to develop emotional responses, which they swore to never tell to their superiors. In 2015, the observers seized control, supposedly made possible by the studies of the scientists. Their future world in 2609 was damaged beyond repair, so they returned to earlier times to enforce a dictatorial style of rule over the world. They struck down upon civilians, who were later termed natives. Could this be happening now? Think about all the strange things that are happening, everything from viruses to bombings. Could it all be planned? So you say, why do you think people are watching us? Well, today I found out about Violet Jessup, Miss Unsinkable, the woman who survived the sinking of the sister ships the Titanic and the Britannic, and was also aboard the third of the trio of Olympic-class vessels, the Olympic, when it had a major accident. Violet Jessup enjoyed incredible luck from a young age. Born in 1887 in Argentina to Irish immigrants, she contracted tuberculosis as a young child and was given just a few months to live. Somehow, she managed to fight the disease and went on to live a long, healthy life. When her father passed away, her mother moved the family to Britain, where she took a job as a stewardess on a ship. While her mother was working, Violet attended a convent school. Unfortunately, her mother became ill, and to provide for her siblings, Violet decided to follow in her mother's footsteps and become a ship stewardess herself. The first in a long line of struggles for Violet was finding a ship that would take her. She was just 21 years old at the time, and most women working as stewardesses in the early 1900s were middle-aged. Employers believed that her youth and good looks would be a disadvantage to her, causing problems with the crew and passengers. Over the course of her career, she did get at least 3 marriage proposals while working on various ships, one from an incredibly wealthy first-class passenger. Eventually, Violet solved the problem by making herself look frumpy with old clothes and no makeup, and experienced more successful interviews after this. After a brief stint aboard the Orinoco, a Royal Mail Line steamer, in 1908, she was hired by the White Star Line. Violet started out on the line's Majestic, switching to the Olympic in 1910. Despite the long hours and minimal pay, £2.10 every month or about £200 today, she enjoyed working aboard the massive ship. She had initially had some concerns about the rough weather conditions while traveling across the Atlantic, but she reportedly liked that the Americans treated her more like a person while she served them. Olympic_collision. It was just 1 year later when the trouble started. In 1911, the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawke, a ship designed to sink ships by ramming them. Both ships sustained considerable damage, including the Olympic having its hull breached below the water line, but miraculously didn't sink. They were able to make it back to port, and Violet disembarked without being harmed. A couple of years later, the White Star Line was looking for crew to cater to the VIPs aboard the unsinkable ship, the Titanic. It took a while for her friends and family to convince her that it would be a wonderful experience, but Violet eventually decided to take a job on board the ship. As you already know, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sunk, killing more than 1,500 people. Violet was able to escape the disaster on Lifeboat 16. In her memoir, she recalls, "I was ordered up on deck. Calmly, passengers strolled about. I stood at the bulkhead with the other stewardesses, watching the women cling to their husbands before being put into the boats with their children. Some time after, a ship's officer ordered us into the boat first to show some women it was safe. As she was jumping into the lifeboat, she was handed a baby to care for. When they were rescued by the Carpathia, the baby's mother, or at least Jessup thought it must be, found her and whisked the baby away, literally grabbing the baby out of Jessop's arms and running off." Once again, Violet lived to sail another day. Although, she did later state the first thing she missed after the Titanic sank was her toothbrush that she'd left on board. You'd think she'd stop getting on ships at this point, or at least ships of the Olympic class, but not Violet. In the lead-up to World War I, she decided to serve as a nurse on board the Titanic's other sister ship, Britannic, which was operating in the Aegean Sea. Given her track record, you can probably guess what happened next. The Britannic ran into a mine that had been planted by a German U-boat. The ship sustained substantial damage and quickly started sinking. This time, Violet wasn't lucky enough to jump into a lifeboat as the ship was sinking too fast. Instead, she jumped overboard. In her own words, "I leapt into the water but was sucked under the ship's keel, which struck my head. I escaped, but years later when I went to my doctor because of a lot of headaches, he discovered I had once sustained a fracture of the skull." She joked that she only survived because of her thick hair, which cushioned the blow. She also stated this time she remembered to grab her toothbrush before evacuating, unlike with the Titanic. Even this latest disaster was not enough to deter Violet. After the war, ships were becoming a more and more popular form of transport. Even cruise ships were starting to emerge. Violet left the White Star Line for the Red Star Line and worked on a ship doing world cruises for several years. Luckily for Violet and everyone traveling on the ships she was aboard later, no such vessel she worked on ever sustained significant damage again. She did take a clerical job for a while after World War II, but went back to working on Royal Mail ships for a few years before she retired at the age of 61. The rest of her life was spent gardening and raising chickens. She died in 1971 of congestive heart failure at the ripe old age of 84. Or so they say. Then I was told about Mason Wells. A few days ago at least 14 people died and dozens more were injured in two explosions that went off near to an American Airlines desk at Zaventem Airport just after 7 local time. Brussels attacks, Ryanair accused of trying to profit from Brits stranded in Belgian capital. An explosion was heard at Malbeek metro station just under an hour later. A Belgian transport officer said that 20 people were killed in the blast. Mason Wells, 19, was hit by shrapnel when the bombs, which were hidden in suitcases, detonated. He ruptured his Achilles tendon and suffered second and third-degree burns on his face and hands. Remarkably, Mason, a Mormon missionary, also survived the Boston Marathon bombing on April 15, 2013, and the Paris attacks last November. This is his third terrorist attack, his father, Chad, told ABC News. This is the third time that sadly in our society that we have a connection to a bomb blast. Mason was a block away from the Boston Marathon finish line, the site of the bombing, when it detonated. He was also in Paris on November 13. Mason is at a Belgian hospital and is expected to make a full recovery. A Mormon official told Mason's parents that despite being on the ground and bleeding he actually had a sense of humor and remained calm through the situation. Joseph MP, 20, was with Mason at the time of the attack and was also injured. He was treated for second-degree burns to his face, hands, and head. Sure, any of the above could be racked up to good luck or bad luck. There are many more cases out there. Anyway, stay safe and paranoid, my friends.